what every Russian schoolboy knows.
Hello and good time of day to all of you, my chess friends. This is Grandmaster Alex Yermolinsky. I'll continue with my series of videos, part of my what every Russian schoolboy knows. This time we talk about night endgames. Well, if you had a chance to check out my first video of this installment, you probably think that this guy is utterly confused. Instead of a confident, a knowledgeable expert, such as I present myself when I talk about rook endgames or opposite cover bishop endgames, you'll see, a confused man, a man who shows you his games and that are full of mistakes and what can you possibly learn? No, I guess, it's better to learn on my mistakes than on yours. So that's one part. And then, secondly, I'd say that I am getting somewhere, however slowly. I'm doing this work now, going over night endgames that I played myself, and then I'm gonna study similar endgames, some selected examples. And I don't know if I can find any good annotations to those games. That's another story. But, well, that part I'm going to do myself. So consider this series of lectures of maybe under subtitle what every Russian schoolboy doesn't know, but is trying to learn, if you wish. So that's one way to approaching it. All right. Next example. That's my game against Grandmaster Milan Drashko. Alright, now what we see here, something that or rather what we don't see, something that we saw in previous examples. In previous examples, white, I think it was white in both cases. My games with Lane and Serper had big advantage in space. Imagine now, in this situation, the white knight being, say, on c6 instead, and the white king on d4, right? And that would be approximately what we had. Now, okay, maybe with the black knight on d7, so there is no immediate loss of material, but you see that white's advantage will be mainly based on activity of the knight and a better position of the king. Sometimes pawns, most of the time, it's pawns that provide us with space advantage. Okay, think of some openings like the King's Indian. You play white, you put your pawn on d5 and you get more space, right? Black in return, of course, is gonna try to put his pawn on f4 and create some space on the king's side. So that's pawns, advancing pawns create space. They push the opponent's pieces back. Here in the knight endgame, I would say that space is created by the kings. Yeah, I guess that's the real similarity between knight endgames and king and pawn endgames. So that's the king, that's a rare case when the king can be driven away. Commonly happens in rook endgames. In fact, it was one of the skills that Rubinstein had. Then he would sometimes retreat with his king under assault of the opponent's rook, well, in order to protect his weaknesses and force the opponent's rook into a passive position. That would almost be the first stage of his plan in rook endgames. Or in bishop endgames, if you wish. The more important thing there is not space, it's where the pawns are. You try to fix the opponent's pawns on the cover of the bishops. Same bishop endgames, of course. Here, indeed, that's where the kings are. And this game truly illustrates it. So, let's see how it went. What did I do? Okay, my opponent played d5. Now it's move 30 and Yeah. So not every time you can convert this extra pawn. More, pardon me, what is this? The more glaring example of poor endgame technique and inability to convert an extra pawn is this. I gotta tell you, most of the time, unless the opponent's king is totally dominating, like Drashka's king was, when he was coming from c4 to b3. This position from one of my numerous games with my old friend and colleague Grandmaster Dmitry Gorevich. I mean, it's just impossible to believe, that black will not win this. Now, the kings are approximately equal in their centralization. Black has a solid extra pawn over there, and he has another advantage of having his a-pawn more advanced than white's a-pawn. Well, this probably goes across most endgames, from pawn endgames to queen endgames. Having your rook pawns further advanced helps a lot, because anytime there is a pawn race, you benefit. Your pawns will queen sooner, and the opponent's pawns will take a longer time. So, great set of advantages here, and let's see how I blew it. Remarkable. First thing that Gorevich did, it was a very good idea. He didn't play king f3, people would play automatically, because that would allow black to attack first. Now, and then the black king can support the knight. So even you may say that the black king is more active because it's on the 5th and the white king is on the 4th and the 3rd, and the 4th rank is kind of contested now. So that's a very good situation here for black. The white knight is already paralyzed. There will be no Zugzwang because the white king can shuffle between d3 and c3. But there are various ways of improving. One of them would be, remember, we already talked about this. One of the very few things that I was able to conclude, like find some similarities between many similar positions that I studied at games. That knight is in the way of the white king. The knight needs to attack the a3 pawn in order to keep the white knight from being active, but this is how it should be accomplished. Then the knight comes to b5. Like here. And then now you can see that not only the white knight cannot move, it's also the white king. Has to guard the c4 square. And then, if both players run out of pawn moves on the king side and then white's turn to move, then black will win. Yeah. Well, the defender should avoid such scenarios. If there is a set of pawns, that blockaded on the other side of the board, it's essentially important to attack the opponent's pawn and force the opponent's knight to defend. So therefore, Dmitry went knight d3, good move, and then this. Okay, the lane and surplus scenario. Yeah, but not quite, because he comes in with the knight. Right, with the king to d3. And I'm almost there. I'm almost there to win this pawn, but I don't. When you look at these variations, you almost see that the knights, I mean, they're opposing knights, of course, but they almost, they don't work together. Together would be a wrong word, but somehow their movement is related to one another. It's you tie up the opponent's knight and then you let it go and then he moves in and you attack and then he switches to defense and he takes the squares you abandon and the other way around. Here it's clearly good for white because the knight on b1 is stuck. No, maybe still, you can think of that, but then of course this one. Now I talk about 4 against 3 being good winning chances, but I mean black really should try for more. So anyway, I went knight to c5. Now I have this thing that the knight is in the way of my king somewhat. But the main problem, of course, is how do I get to c4? Alright, so Zugzwang things, right? Of course. And I started working on the Zugzwang with the typical move h5, f6, and now g4, and I answered it with h4. Now I should praise myself for good play. It's very important to advance those h-pawns. If anything, well, if anything you can do in knight endgames without calculating a whole lot of variations, it's stuff like this. h4, okay, great, So white is about to run out of time, and then hopefully I can gain the d4 square for my king, which basically would be the end of the game. g5. Well, somehow I just felt that this would be an accomplishment for white because it's black who kind of ran out of moves. Here, black is in Zugzwang. And would have to go e5. Although the consequences of e5 are not bad at all. Because in this situation, how about just going after that g6 pawn? Here's where I went wrong. Counterplay. When you play rook endgames, you want to prevent counterplay. Rubinstein's method, right? You always keep the opponent on the defensive. Because, counterplay when with one pawn and the active king and all that, well, you may be able to win your rook for his passed pawn, and then, well, most of the time you can only hope for a draw, right, with king and pawns. Knight endgames are different. And besides, what did I put my pawns to the fourth rank for? Precisely for this kind of scenario, to win a race. And I would, easily. Check, okay, doesn't matter. We can see here that the black knight can easily stop the a-pawn. In fact, maybe black can even try to queen his h-pawn sooner. I think the right idea now is to king g5 followed by knight f4. I mean, I know it's easily winning for black, I don't want to look at any more variations here. So the win was there, yep. But somehow I became prisoner of this rigid, dogmatic approach of I want to win this game without giving him a single chance. I'm just going to, creating an endgame masterpiece that generation of players will be studying and admiring. That's the last thing you should worry about, your job is to win chess games and put points in a tournament table, If you want to follow anyone's healthy, pragmatic approach to this, it will be Hikaru Nakamura. Just look at him. He wins games, wins tournaments. And that's the last thing on his mind, Similar to Karpov. I won. Well, that's all that counts. I won 160 tournaments or whatever he said. And Nakamura may be on his way of winning 160 tournaments. Should probably ask Hikaru how many tournaments he won so far, because he's still young and he can rack them up. Anyway, so here in this position I took, on g5. Maybe there was another explanation, because, yeah, I felt maybe the pawn on g6, who knows, some miraculous jump, knight takes g7, and he queens his pawn. Of course, it was not gonna happen. Now, but what's wrong with this? Well, nothing really. But this. Okay, I must go forward. And that. I went e5. I guess maybe here, right? What was wrong with king b3? Ah, knight d4. Doesn't do anything. Yeah, white is unable to create any meaningful counterplay by grabbing some pawns. And if they arrest the king there on a file, no, one way or another, way, some knight check or advance of the e-pawn. I mean, I don't know, just winning the second pawn was the key here, you know. I didn't want to allow any kind of activity from the opponent. That's the wrong way to approach, at least knight endgames, that's for sure. Because all these things, they need to be measured in a concrete situation with some calculation. Yeah, the king on d4, the white knight on e4, but what do they do? If they cannot get any pawns, and you are getting a pawn, then that's it. e5, that's bad. Now, that's just messing around, right? Now, another part from practical game. Sudden death time controls, you get low on time, you know. You better go through the stages quicker, because in the end it's still, you need to calculate some variations, and going back and forth, changing your plan and reconsidering, it's just impractical. Just impractical. You have to take a practical decision and go along, you know, the main plan that was bring the king to b3 and take the pawn. Somehow it contradicts on some level this principle of do not hurry, but no, it's up to you to figure out. When you're not hurrying and being a good, you know, endgame player, or you just waffle around and do nothing, then you're a bad endgame player. Everybody should find their own balance in this. I'll show you what happened, and somehow all my attempts to keep that knight from doing things, ultimately they failed. Already I had to solve some serious problems. Here the situation is different, because a capture of the pawn will give white a lot of play with the g5 pawn. So the king c4 b3 is already out. So what I needed to do, I needed to find a proper way of playing in the center and the king side, where we have mutual weaknesses. Obviously, it's all about Zugzwang. This was a great move, because if the white king goes forward, then you got check, and then take another one. Okay, so that's 2 pawns up. Hang on 1 second. If king goes there, and then I've got king e5, and then I come with my king back. It's triangulation, right? And if he goes knight f6, that's away from the e5 square, then I return to this plan, because he cannot answer it with knight e5 takes g6. No, triangulation. Yeah, instead, king e6, bad move. Now king up. I actually had this idea. I was totally wrong, of course. I thought it was very clever, right? Yeah, I knew that he probably wouldn't go over there because of the check, and then I grab pawns. Yeah, right, but after king f4, I assume that I'm gonna take the pawn on a3 and have a classic remote passed pawn that should win the game. Look what Dmitry found. With so much distance between g4 and a4, he finds a way to win the pawn. I had to play king d5, because in reply to this, there it comes. A fork is threatening that gives me no time to remove the knight, my knight from the path of my pawn. And if I play some move, then he's got knight b2. Amazing. Short range piece, the knight yet gets from g4 to a4. Yeah, the rest of the game was, around here we totally ran out of time. And I think that was before delay, and certainly there was no increment. It was played in some tournament in Los Angeles. I think it was Continental Open here before I permanently moved to the East Coast. And neither player had any time. We were blitzing out. And I played the right move and I advanced the king. So now I'm back to playing the good chess, but after losing my extra pawn. Black's probably still winning, and I saw this idea. But it's just wrong interpretation of it. I simply should have captured that pawn. What I didn't like was this check, of course, because another miracle from Dmitry Gurovich. He's a miracle player, really. He finds so many unusual things on the chessboard. I mean, how can one knight take this pawn fighting against the black king and the knight? Yeah, but right here I had a win. I saw this idea too soon. Now this check would force the white king over there, and now you come king f4, and mate is unstoppable. Now, this is totally out of left field. I don't know why it's there at all. I haven't seen many mating patterns in knight endgames. With knights are, relatively speaking, low power pieces. But in this case, the white pawn on h3. That's it. So it's checkmate. Unfortunately, I saw this idea too late, so I played this first. And then I took. Now my knight is in the wrong position. And then I played for this thing anyway, and I gave this check. And oh, horror. Dmitry, instead of playing his king out, basically forcing a draw after this check and then king back. He took. Oh, disaster. Mate's unstoppable. So this is how I won this game, Well, that is probably the most most mistakes-filled endgame I ever had in my career, And that I owe to two things. First of all, the complexity of knight endgames, how difficult they are to play, and my relatively low skill level. Now we're working on it. If you guys follow me, well, whatever Russian schoolboy doesn't know but trying to learn, well then, hopefully together we'll get somewhere. Thank you so much. This was Grandmaster Alex Yermolinsky. Until our next installment.